Chapter 1. If I stop fighting, it will rip me open from the inside. Crack. The sickening sound of bending bone echoed through the damp interrogation cell. Thick, black blood dripped from Odessa's fingertips as her nails dug violently into her own chest. Her body convulsed, muscles straining against the heavy iron chains. For a fraction of a second, her natural irises violently flickered, swallowed entirely by a pitch-black void before snapping back. She tore a jagged line across her pale collarbone, but before the black blood could even hit the freezing stone floor, the torn flesh knitted itself back together in a blur of dark, unnatural magic. Instant, terrifying regeneration. "Shoot her! Just shoot her!" the first guard screamed. His hands were shaking so violently that he dropped his loaded crossbow. The second guard drew his sword, but his knees buckled. He backed away until his spine hit the iron door, completely paralyzed by absolute terror. He didn't dare take a single step closer. Odessa's spine arched at a horrific angle. When she looked up this time, the whites of her eyes were completely gone, permanently consumed by the dark void. "Let me out," the voice hissed. It didn't come from her lips. It vibrated directly through the heavy air. "Let me feast." With a brutal, agonizing surge of willpower, Odessa forced her hands down. She collapsed forward, gasping for air, her heartbeat pounding loudly in the silence as she shoved the entity back into the dark cage of her ribs. She slowly raised her head, looking at the trembling guards. A dark, mocking smile stretched across her lips. "I didn't come here to die," Odessa whispered, her voice laced with a terrifying layered echo. "I came here to choose who dies first." Boom! The heavy iron door slammed open. The impact hit the stone like a cannon blast. The air in the tiny cell instantly vanished. It was replaced by the suffocating heavy scent of wood smoke, ozone, and pure alpha dominance. "Get out," a voice commanded, low, rough, and absolute. The terrified guards didn't hesitate. They scrambled out of the room, leaving their weapons behind and slamming the door shut. Odessa tilted her chin. Cold, golden eyes stared down at her. General Varric, the king's most lethal weapon, the heir who looked at the throne with nothing but disgust. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask what had just happened. He simply dropped to one knee, his massive frame trapping her against the wall. He reached out. Rough fingers caught her chin in a vice grip, forcing her to look at him. A jolt of raw electricity shot through Odessa's jaw the second his skin touched hers. Her breath hitched. The heat of his touch bypassed the freezing dampness of the cell, burning straight into her blood. Varric's golden eyes darkened. His thumb swept over her collarbone, catching a fresh drop of her blackened blood right before the skin fully healed over. He brought it to his nose and inhaled slowly. His jaw tightened. A twisted, knowing smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth. "Rot," Varric murmured, his voice a deadly caress. "Black ash and decaying magic. You aren't a rebel spy, little wolf." Odessa stopped breathing. One breath, and he had unraveled the secret that had slaughtered her entire bloodline. "Are you going to kill me, General?" she challenged, hiding her panic behind a glare. "Do it. Cut my head off. See what crawls out of my neck." Varric leaned in closer, his possessive scent wrapped tightly around her, drowning out the smell of the dungeon. "Kill you?" he asked quietly. "Why would I destroy a perfectly good bomb?" Odessa jerked against her iron cuffs. "What do you want?" "You didn't come here to steal gold," Varric said, his gaze dropping to her lips before snapping back to her eyes. "You came to poison the well. You want to bring my father's kingdom to its knees." "He murdered my people." "He did," Varric agreed easily. "No remorse. And his empire is a festering corpse that deserves to be put in the ground. But you can't do it from a dungeon cell." He stood up, towering over her. He reached out and grabbed the thick iron chains binding her wrists. With a sharp, terrifying twist, the heavy metal snapped like brittle twigs. Odessa rubbed her raw wrists, staring at him. "You're committing treason." "I'm getting married," Varric corrected smoothly. Odessa froze. "What?" "The king demands an heir. He demands a grand, public spectacle of a wedding to solidify my loyalty," Varric said, looking down at her. "You are going to be my devoted fiancé." "You are insane," Odessa breathed out. "If I lose control, I will slaughter your entire court." "That's the point." Varric stepped into her space again, his hand wrapped around the back of her neck, pulling her flush against his chest. The sudden, hard contact sent a violent shiver down her spine. I don't want a submissive wife, I want a weapon. Odessa didn't flinch. She looked up into his cold, beautiful eyes and smiled. You don't need to chain me, General, she whispered, her voice dripping with venom. I walked into your kingdom on purpose. Varric's eyes flared with a sudden dark hunger. Walk with me, my beautiful ruin, he ordered. He turned and kicked the iron door open. Odessa stepped out into the blindingly bright hallway. But as her eyes adjusted, she noticed they were not alone. A few yards down the corridor, a man was on his hands and knees. He was scrubbing the spotless stone floor with frantic, desperate energy. Brecken, Varric barked. Get up. The beta froze. His hands were raw, clutching a wet rag. Brecken slowly raised his head. He looked at Varric, then his gaze slid to Odessa. The moment Brecken's eyes locked onto her, all the color drained from his face. The rag slipped from his trembling fingers. Boss! Brecken stammered, scrambling backward until his back hit the wall. His eyes were wide with absolute, unfiltered terror. Odessa frowned. Brecken raised a shaking finger, pointing not at Odessa, but at the empty air directly behind her. Boss, Brecken whispered, his voice cracking. The shadow, the thing behind her, it's smiling. Chapter 2. Varric's estate did not feel like a home. It felt like a beautifully decorated tomb. There were no servants rushing through the halls, no warmth in the massive hearths, only the suffocating silence of cold marble and the lingering, oppressive scent of the general's alpha aura. Odessa stood in the center of the sprawling master bedroom. The heavy oak door behind her wasn't locked, but she knew better than to run. You didn't run from the apex predator in his own territory. A sharp knock broke the silence. The door creaked open, and a trembling young maid stepped inside, keeping her eyes glued to the floor. She carried a silver tray with a small, wicker basket of pastries. From the town, my lady, the maid stuttered, her voice barely a whisper. A gift to celebrate your sudden engagement. She set the tray on the velvet ottoman and practically sprinted out of the room. Odessa approached the basket. The pastries were delicate, dusted with powdered sugar. But something was wrong. Her heightened senses picked up a faint, metallic tang beneath the smell of butter and yeast. She picked up the largest pastry and snapped it in half. It wasn't filled with cream. Thick, dark crimson liquid oozed from the center, dripping onto the silver tray. As the droplets hit the metal, they began to move, sizzling and shifting until they formed jagged, handwritten words in the center of the platter. The king suspects Varric. Hurry! T. Odessa stared at the blood ink. Tamsin. The blind oracle was already pulling the strings. Before Odessa could wipe the tray clean, a violent spasm ripped through her chest. She gasped, dropping the broken pastry. Her knees buckled, sending her crashing to the plush rug. Too slow, the voice hissed in her mind. It wasn't a whisper this time, it was a roar. I am starving. I am drowning in this cage of flesh. No, Odessa choked out, her hands clawing at the collar of her dress. Let me out. The rot surged. It didn't just speak, it took the wheel. Odessa's body went terrifyingly rigid. When her eyes snapped open, the whites were entirely gone, replaced by a deep, bottomless void of pitch black. Thick, dark veins crawled up her neck, spiderwebbing across her jawline. She stood up. The movements were jerky, unnatural like a marionette dragged by invisible strings. She walked toward the towering glass doors leading to the balcony. The midnight wind whipped through her hair as she stepped out into the freezing air. If we cannot feast on them, the entity spoke through her lips, her voice layered with the raspy echo of 1,000 dead souls. We will feast on you. Odessa's right hand raised. Her fingers curled inward, the nails sharpening, turning into jagged obsidian claws. She didn't want to do it. Her mind was screaming in absolute terror, trapped behind her own eyes, but she had no control. Her clawed hand swung down, aiming straight for her own heart to rip the cage open. A hand made of pure, unforgiving steel caught her wrist in midair. The impact cracked like a whip. Before the rot could react, a massive force violently shoved her backward. Odessa's spine hit the stone wall of the balcony, knocking the breath from her lungs. Varric pinned her there. He didn't look tired. He looked furious. His golden eyes were glowing in the dark, burning with a lethal, territorial rage. His chest heaved, pressed flush against hers, his sheer size completely dwarfing her small frame. I didn't bring you into my home for you to gut yourself on my balcony, Varric snarled, his grip on her wrist tightening until the bones creaked. Let me go, Alpha. The rot hissed through Odessa's mouth. She bared her teeth, trying to bite at his arm. She is mine to break. Varric didn't flinch, he didn't step back. Instead, he stepped closer. His thigh slid aggressively between her legs, pinning her lower body to the stone. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. The heavy, intoxicating scent of ozone, dark woods, and predatory dominance exploded in the air. He didn't just use his strength. He weaponized his alpha aura. A crushing, invisible weight slammed down on the balcony. It was a command meant to break the spine of entire armies. She, Varric growled, his voice vibrating deep in his chest, is mine to use. The sheer, overwhelming pressure of his dominance forced the darkness to recede. The black veins on Odessa's neck rapidly faded. The pitch-black void drained from her eyes, leaving her wide, gasping, and entirely herself again. Odessa slumped against the wall, her chest heaving as she sucked in the freezing night air. She was trembling violently, the aftermath of the possession leaving her drained. But Varric didn't let her go. He kept her pinned, his body radiating a scorching heat that seeped into her freezing skin. His gaze dropped to her trembling lips, then back to her eyes. The tension between them shifted from violent hostility to a dark, suffocating gravity. You don't get to choose when you die, Varric whispered. His thumb brushed over her racing pulse point at the base of her throat. It wasn't a comforting touch. It was a claim. If you are going to explode, little ruin, you don't do it until I give the order. Odessa looked up at him. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, entirely separate from the entity inside her. She hated the king. She hated the world. But in this exact second, she realized how terrifyingly easy it would be to let this broken, beautiful monster consume her completely. Are you going to keep holding me against this wall, General? Odessa fired back, her voice raspy but defiant. Or are you actually going to... Crash. The massive glass doors of the bedroom exploded outward. Shards of glass rained down on the balcony like deadly hail. Varric instantly grabbed the back of Odessa's head, violently shoving her face into his chest to shield her from the flying debris. 4 towering figures stepped through the shattered frame. They wore the silver and black armor of the king's elite guard. Their eyes were devoid of emotion, and they held curved blades dripping with a strange, glowing green poison. Assassin. The king sends his regards for your engagement, General. The lead assassin sneered, stepping onto the balcony. Varric slowly turned his head. His arm remained wrapped protectively around Odessa's waist, tucking her slightly behind him. The air around Varric dropped 10 degrees. His golden eyes flared brighter than the moon above them. You tracked mud on my floor, Varric said quietly. The lethal calm in his voice was far more terrifying than a scream. Chapter 3. Varric didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need one. He moved with a terrifying liquid speed that defied his massive size. He closed the distance before the first assassin could even raise his poisoned blade. Varric's hand wrapped around the man's throat. A sickening crack echoed over the balcony. The assassin went completely limp and was casually tossed over the stone railing into the darkness below. 3 left, Varric stated, his voice devoid of anything human. But the smell of sudden death hit the air, and inside Odessa's chest the beast woke up. Blood. The rot hissed, slithering up her throat. Fresh blood. Let me play. Odessa didn't fight it this time. She stepped out from behind Varric. Her eyes bled into pitch black. The dark veins violently crawled up her neck, her fingers extending into obsidian claws. One of the assassins lunged at her. Odessa didn't dodge. She caught the blade with her bare hand. The poisoned steel shattered against her darkened skin like cheap glass. With a twisted, inhuman smile, she grabbed the man by his armored collar and hurled him through the bedroom wall. The stone violently caved in around him. More, the entity wearing Odessa's face demanded, turning its hollow, black gaze toward the remaining 2 men. But the lead assassin didn't raise his sword. He didn't look afraid. He reached into his cloak and pulled out a fist-sized, heavily glowing amber stone. The king warned us about the parasite, the assassin sneered. He crushed the stone in his armored fist. A blinding shockwave of white light blasted across the balcony. It didn't carry physical force, but the moment the light hit Odessa, an agonizing, deafening scream erupted not from her mouth, but from the depths of her mind. The rot shrieked. The dark veins on Odessa's neck instantly turned to frost. The ancient binding magic didn't just suppress the entity, it aggressively paralyzed the host. Odessa gasped, her eyes snapping back to their natural color, her heart seized. Her legs gave out, her body collapsing like a severed puppet. She hit the stone floor hard, entirely paralyzed from the neck down. Odessa! Varek roared. He stepped forward to reach her, but the third assassin threw a barrage of explosive charges between them. The balcony erupted in a wall of blinding fire and smoke, forcing Varek back. Through the thick smoke, Odessa watched helplessly as the lead assassin grabbed her by the collar of her dress, dragging her dead weight toward the edge of the balcony. "Let her go!" Varek's voice boomed through the smoke, heavy with a lethal, world-ending command. The sheer force of his alpha aura made the stone beneath them crack. The assassin gritted his teeth against the pressure, hauling Odessa up. "The king reclaims his property, General. You should have picked a safer bride." Odessa's chest was barely rising. She couldn't move her fingers. She couldn't fight, but she forced her head to turn, locking eyes with Varek through the clearing smoke. "Let them," Odessa choked out, her voice a fragile, broken rasp. "Let the bomb walk into his castle. It's what you wanted." Varek's golden eyes flared with a terrifying, absolute rage. He wasn't looking at a weapon anymore. He was looking at something that belonged to him. "You don't leave until I give the order," Varek snarled, launching himself through the fading flames. But the assassin stepped backward off the ledge, pulling Odessa with him into the void. A sharp, violent pulse of teleportation magic shattered the air. By the time Varek's hand slammed down on the stone railing, there was nothing but empty night air. They were gone. Silence slammed heavily back into the estate. The only sound was the crackle of burning wood from the shattered doors. Varek stood entirely still at the edge of the balcony. He didn't scream. He didn't punch the wall. He just stared out into the darkness, his chest rising and falling in a slow, calculated rhythm. Footsteps rushed into the ruined bedroom. "Boss!" Brecken skidded to a halt amidst the shattered glass and broken stone. The beta looked around frantically, his eyes widening when he realized who was missing. They took her? The king's guard took the girl? Brecken panicked, his OCD flaring as he began wiping his sweating palms on his pants. "If she blows up in the palace, the king will blame you. He'll execute the entire estate. We need to run. We need to pack and—" "Brecken." Varek slowly turned around. Brecken snapped his mouth shut. The breath died in his throat. Varek's golden eyes were no longer just glowing. They were burning like a dying sun. The suffocating weight of his aura was so heavy that the remaining glass panes in the room began to crack under the pressure. "Get my armor," Varek commanded, his voice eerily, terrifyingly calm. Brecken swallowed hard. "Boss, you step foot in the royal dungeon with a blade. That's open rebellion. That's war." Varek walked past him, his boots crunching over the broken glass. "They came into my house," Varek said, not looking back. "They touched my bride. Tell the men to prepare for a bloodbath." Chapter 4. The royal dungeon was supposed to be impenetrable. Varek didn't bother with the keys. The heavy, steel-reinforced door of cell block 4 violently caved inward. It tore off its hinges, flying across the room and crushing 2 royal guards against the far wall. The impact echoed like a thunderclap. Dust and debris choked the air. Through the smoke, Varek walked in. He didn't wear ceremonial armor. He wore pitch-black combat leather, carrying a broadsword that hadn't seen the light of day since the border wars. "General," the block commander shouted, drawing his weapon with shaking hands. "Stand down, by order of the king." Varek didn't slow his pace. He didn't even look at the man. He simply unleashed his alpha aura. The invisible, crushing weight of it slammed into the room. Every guard in the block instantly dropped to their knees, gasping for air as their lungs seized. Weapons clattered uselessly to the stone floor. Varek stepped over them. His golden eyes were locked onto the iron chair at the center of the room. Odessa was slumped in it. She looked terrifyingly fragile. The amber binding magic had forced the rot into a deep, paralyzing sleep, but it was dragging her life force down with it. Her skin was deathly pale. Dark, unnatural blood dripped slowly from her lips. Standing over her was the king's royal inquisitor. The man held a glowing, rune-carved syringe, preparing to plunge it directly into Odessa's chest to extract the parasite. The inquisitor turned, his eyes widening in panic at the sight of the general. "You are committing treason." Varek didn't speak. He closed the distance in a single blurring stride. A flash of silver cut through the dim light. The Inquisitor's scream ripped through the damp air. The rune-carved syringe hit the stone floor with a heavy clatter, still firmly clutched inside the Inquisitor's severed hand. The man collapsed, sobbing and clutching the ruined stump of his arm. Varric didn't give him a second glance. He drove the hilt of his sword into the Inquisitor's temple, silencing him instantly. The broadsword clattered to the ground. Varric fell to his knees in front of Odessa. His massive hands grabbed the iron cuffs binding her wrists, snapping them effortlessly. He caught her before she could hit the floor, pulling her freezing body flush against his chest. Odessa. His voice was a harsh, demanding rasp. She didn't open her eyes. Her breathing was a shallow, broken rattle. Varric's jaw tightened. He bit his own wrist, tearing the skin, and forcefully pressed his bleeding arm against her lips. Drink. Now. The thick, potent scent of alpha blood hit her senses. Odessa's instincts flared. Weakly, her lips parted. She swallowed the warm blood. The raw power in his veins acted like a shock to her dying system, forcing her heart to kickstart. She gasped, her eyes snapping open. She choked, coughing up a mouthful of black, cursed blood onto his dark leather armor. Varric didn't care about the mess. His hand aggressively gripped the back of her head, anchoring her to him. "You're late," Odessa whispered. Her voice was destroyed, but the venom was still there. "You're still breathing," Varric countered, his thumb wiping the black blood from her chin. "Don't complain." Odessa looked up at him. She hated him. She hated his arrogance, his cruelty, his utter disregard for human life. But as his body heat seeped into her freezing skin, a terrifying realization washed over her. Her inner wolf wasn't rejecting him. It was imprinting on him. It craved the very violence he had just committed for her. "You didn't come to save me," Odessa accused, pushing weakly against his chest. "You just didn't want the king to take your toy." "You are my weapon," Varric corrected, his grip on her tightening. "Nobody touches what is mine." "I am a bomb," Odessa yelled, her voice breaking. "And you just started a civil war to get me back. They will brand you a traitor. They will execute your men. You ruined your entire life for a parasite." "My life was ruined the day I was born into this bloodline." Varric's eyes darkened, the gold bleeding into a cold, terrifying amber. Odessa stared at him, the tension between them thick enough to choke on. "Why do you hate him so much? Why do you want to burn down your own legacy? He is your father." Varric went perfectly still. The silence in the dungeon was deafening. The only sound was the jagged rhythm of Odessa's breathing. Varric leaned in. His face was inches from hers, his expression completely devoid of humanity. "He is not my father," Varric said quietly. Odessa frowned, her heart stuttering. "What?" "The king has no royal blood. He is a usurper. A dark alchemist who stole the crown," Varric whispered, his words slicing through the air like a poisoned blade. "And he didn't just murder your people, Odessa." He let the silence stretch for a fraction of a second, ensuring the truth hit her with maximum impact. "He is the one who created the thing living inside your chest." Chapter 5. "He is the one who created the thing living inside your chest." The words hung in the freezing, blood-soaked air of the dungeon. Odessa stopped breathing. Her mind violently rejected the information, but her blood blackened and cursed recognized the absolute truth. The slaughter of her tribe hadn't been an execution. It had been an experiment, a petri dish for a madman's dark alchemy. Before she could speak, Varric scooped her up. He didn't wait for the royal guard to mobilize. He carried her out of the ruined cell block, leaving nothing but broken bodies in his wake. By the time they reached the heavily fortified bunker beneath his estate, the amber binding magic had completely burned out of Odessa's system. Varric set her down on the edge of the massive, dark velvet bed. "Breathe," he ordered, turning his back to pour a harsh shot of liquor. "The king's army will be here before dawn. I need you conscious." Odessa didn't answer. She was staring at her own hands. The veins beneath her skin were shifting. They weren't just dark anymore. They were pulsing, violently matching the frantic rhythm of a second heartbeat inside her chest. "Varric," she whispered. Her voice trembled. He turned around, the glass halfway to his mouth. He froze. A sickening, wet laugh bubbled up from Odessa's throat. It wasn't her laugh. It was a twisted, echoing harmony of 1,000 dead souls vibrating through her vocal cords. Odessa's spine snapped completely straight. The sheer force of the movement should have broken her back. When she looked up, the terrified girl was gone. Her eyes were twin pools of pitch-black void. "You think you know everything, little alpha," the entity purred. Varric dropped the glass. It shattered on the stone floor. He didn't draw his sword, but the suffocating weight of his aura slammed down on the room instantly. "Rot," Varric growled, his golden eyes flashing dangerously. "I told you to stay down." "Or what?" The thing wearing Odessa's face tilted its head. "You will kill your beautiful ruin?" "I don't think so." Odessa's body moved with an unnatural, liquid grace. She stood up, closing the distance between them in the blink of an eye. She didn't attack. She placed her cold, darkened hands flat against Varric's armored chest, her strength easily matching his massive frame, forcing him a step backward against the heavy oak table. Deep inside the sunken cage of her own mind, the real Odessa was screaming. Pure, unfiltered horror ripped through her consciousness. She was paralyzed, forced to watch through her own eyes as the monster hijacked her flesh. "What do you want?" Varric snarled, his hands gripping her wrists. He was holding back, terrified of breaking Odessa's fragile bones. The rot weaponized that hesitation. It leaned in, its breath freezing against his skin. "You think we want to kill the king?" The rot whispered, its voice slipping into his mind like venom. "Why would we destroy the soil that grew us? But he is old, weak, he is a dying son." The entity dragged a jagged, black nail over the pulse point on Varric's neck. "But you," it hissed, a terrifying hunger in its hollow eyes. "You are the apex. We don't want his throne, Varric. We want to merge our black with your gold. Let us in. Give us your rage, and together we will hollow out this world until there is nothing left but us." Inside, Odessa violently fought the possession. "No, stop, get away from him." The psychic revulsion bleeding from Odessa's trapped soul was so strong it made the entity twitch. Varric felt it. He looked into those black, bottomless eyes and saw the flicker of Odessa's absolute terror buried beneath the parasite's cosmic hunger. His golden eyes turned completely lethal. "You picked the wrong man," Varric said. His voice dropped to a terrifying, guttural whisper. He didn't hold back this time. Varric's hands clamped down on Odessa's forearms like steel traps. With a brutal, violently explosive heave, he threw the entity off him. The rot shrieked as it hit the stone floor, sliding backward. Varric shot forward, towering over the creature. He looked at it with pure, unfiltered disgust. "I don't let parasite touch me," Varric sneered, wiping his neck where her nail had dragged. "And if you ever use her face to look at me like that again, I will rip you out of her chest with my bare hands and burn you to ash." The rot snarled, rising to its hands and knees. The black veins on Odessa's skin pulsed aggressively as it prepared to strike back. Boom. The entire bunker violently shook. Dust and debris rained down from the vaulted ceiling. The heavy steel door of the safe room was practically kicked off its hinges. Brecken burst in. The beta's immaculate uniform was torn to shreds, soaked in blood. He was hyperventilating, his eyes blown wide with absolute panic. "Boss!" Brecken screamed over the deafening blare of the estate's alarms. Varric didn't take his eyes off the rot. "Report. They broke the outer perimeter. It's the king's vanguard." Brecken pointed frantically toward the stairs. "He's here, boss. The king came himself." The rot let out a twisted, delighted laugh from the floor. "Father is home." Varric ignored the monster. He grabbed his broadsword from the table. "Hold the choke point at the stairs. Let them bleed for every inch." "You don't understand." Brecken grabbed Varric's arm, an unforgivable breach of protocol, but the beta was beyond terrified. "He didn't just bring swords, boss." Brecken wiped a streak of blood across his pale forehead, his voice cracking. "He brought the purifier. The machine, it's rolling through the courtyard right now. He doesn't want to capture her anymore. He wants to lock her in that box and drain every single drop of her blood to get the curse back." Chapter 6. The estate was tearing itself apart. Deafening explosions rocked the stone foundation. The heavy scent of burning wood, ozone, and dark alchemy flooded down the bunker stairs. "Move," Varric ordered. He didn't wait for Odessa to fully recover. He grabbed her arm, hauling her to her feet. The rot was quiet now, violently retreating deep into the cage of her ribs. It wasn't dormant. It was terrified by the sheer, crushing proximity of the king's unnatural machine above them. Varric shoved his broadsword into Brecken's chest. "Take the west corridor, blow the support pillars, bury the vanguard in the rubble." "What about you?" Brecken yelled over the alarms, gripping the hilt with white knuckles. "I am taking her to the lower catacombs." Varric's golden eyes were cold, entirely calculated. The purifier cannot drill through blessed bedrock. Varric dragged Odessa up the stone steps to the ground-level hall. The sheer scale of the destruction stopped her tracks. The heavy oak doors of the estate were completely blown out. In the courtyard, a massive, monstrous machine hummed with sick, green energy. The purifier. It looked like a mechanical iron maiden, rigged with thick glass tubes meant to siphon a person's life force, drop by agonizing drop. Hundreds of the king's vanguard flooded the yard, their weapons drawn, advancing in a perfect lethal formation. Varric stepped in front of Odessa, entirely shielding her. He prepared to unleash a shockwave of alpha dominance that would kill half the men in the courtyard, even if it ruptured his own lungs. But a sudden, chilling sound echoed through the burning air. Chow. Chow. A massive murder of crows dropped from the black sky. They didn't fly, they plummeted like stones, landing on the vanguard's armored shoulders, the walls, the ruins. Their eyes were entirely milky white. Dead birds. The vanguard stopped. The king's commander raised his glowing blade, looking around in confusion. Footsteps echoed softly against the broken cobblestone. A woman walked straight into the middle of the war zone. She wore a simple white dress, completely barefoot. A thick silver blindfold wrapped around her eyes, heavily stitched into her own skin. Tamsin, the former royal oracle. "Witch!" the vanguard commander barked. "Stand down or we will cut you to pieces." Tamsin didn't stop walking. She stopped directly in front of the commander, tilting her head. "I sewed my eyes shut 10 years ago," Tamsin said. Her voice carried effortlessly over the fires, soft and utterly haunting. "I did it so I wouldn't have to watch this kingdom eat itself alive." "Kill her," the commander ordered. 3 soldiers lunged forward with their spears. Tamsin raised her hands. Her fingers caught the silver threads digging into her temples. With one violent, horrific pull, she ripped the stitches out. The silver blindfold dropped to the dirt. Thick lines of dark crimson blood spilled down Tamsin's pale cheeks. When she opened her eyes, there were no pupils. There was only a blindingly white light, the raw, unfiltered power of the death's gaze. The 3 soldiers froze mid-lunge. Their weapons dropped. Their hands flew to their helmets. A collective, agonizing scream ripped through the front lines of the vanguard. The oracle's gaze didn't burn their flesh, it shattered their minds. Driven instantly, violently insane by the visions of their own deaths, the vanguard soldiers turned. They didn't attack Tamsin. They raised their blades and turned on each other. Absolute, chaotic carnage erupted in the courtyard. The king's perfect army imploded, drowning in friendly fire. "Now," Varric barked. He didn't waste a single second of Tamsin's sacrifice. He grabbed Odessa around the waist, lifting her entirely off the ground, and sprinted down the dark, spiraling staircase leading into the forbidden catacombs beneath the estate. The heavy iron door slammed shut behind them, locking them in pitch-black darkness. Varric set her down. The air down here was freezing, ancient and dead. But the silence didn't last. The sheer volume of blood being spilled directly above them began to seep through the stone foundation. The copper, metallic scent of a massacre dripped down the walls. Odessa gasped. Her hands flew to her chest. The rot hadn't just woken up. It was drowning in the scent of mass death, and it was going completely feral. Black veins violently exploded across Odessa's throat, crawling up her jawline faster than before. Her bones cracked softly as the entity fought to stretch her limbs, desperate to claw its way up to the surface and join the slaughter. "No," Odessa choked out, slamming her back against the cold stone wall. She dug her own fingernails into her arms, trying to anchor herself to the pain. Varric stepped toward her, his golden eyes glowing in the dark. "Odessa, look at me." "Stay back!" she screamed. It was her voice, but layered beneath it was a guttural, demonic growl. "It smells the blood, Varric. It's going to tear me open. I am right here. Fight it." "I can't." Odessa dropped to her knees. Black tears, thick like tar, spilled from her eyes. She looked up at him, her expression entirely broken, fully aware that she was losing the war inside her own mind. She reached out, grabbing the cold leather of Varric's armor. She didn't pull him in for a kiss. She pulled him down so she could look straight into his eyes. "Kill me," Odessa ordered. Her voice was violently shaking, but the command was absolute. Varric went rigidly still. "No." "Do it!" she screamed, hitting his armored chest with a trembling fist. If I go back up there, it will kill your men. It will kill Brecken. It will kill you. Drive your sword through my chest right now, General. Stop being a coward and kill the bomb. Varric grabbed both of her wrists, pinning them against the stone floor. He leaned over her, his massive frame trapping her entirely. You don't get to die to save my conscience, Varric snarled, his face inches from hers. The pure, suffocating weight of his alpha aura slammed into her, fighting a brutal war against the dark magic in her veins. Varric, please, Odessa begged, the black void bleeding into her irises. It hurts, it's tearing me apart. Then let me carry the weight, Varric whispered. His eyes didn't hold pity, they held a dark, terrifying possessiveness. Varric didn't draw his sword. He lowered his head, his lips grazing the erratic, racing pulse on the side of her neck. He opened his mouth, and his fangs fully extended. Chapter 7. Varric's fangs tore into her flesh. It wasn't a gentle, romantic claim. It was a violent, brutal anchoring. Odessa's back arched sharply off the cold stone floor. A ragged, breathless scream tore from her throat, but the sound was instantly swallowed against Varric's armored shoulder. The pain was blinding. But beneath the pain, something ancient and terrifying snapped into place. The rot shrieked. The dark magic instantly surged toward the wound, trying to infect the intruder. But Varric didn't pull back. He drove his fangs deeper, aggressively forcing his overwhelming alpha aura straight into her bloodstream. He didn't just bite her. He tied his soul to the bomb. Odessa gasped. Her eyes snapped wide open, the pitch-black void rapidly shattering as her natural eye color flooded back. Suddenly, half the agonizing, suffocating weight of the curse vanished from her chest. Varric ripped his mouth away. He staggered backward, hitting the stone wall of the catacomb hard. He dropped to one knee, his broad chest heaving violently. A sickening, thick black vein instantly crawled up his neck from beneath his leather collar. He choked, coughing up a spatter of dark, cursed blood onto the floor. Odessa scrambled toward him, her hand flying to the bleeding mark on her neck. Her mind was entirely her own again. "What did you do?" she demanded, her voice shaking with absolute horror. "Varric." He didn't look at her. He gripped the hilt of his broadsword, his knuckles turning white as he fought a brutal internal war to suppress the dark magic now coursing through his own veins. The black vein on his neck pulsed, then slowly, agonizingly faded beneath his skin. He slowly raised his head. His golden eyes were dim, shadowed by exhaustion, but the fierce, territorial possession in them was fully intact. "I took half," Varric rasped, wiping a mix of crimson and black blood from his chin. Odessa stared at him, her chest rising and falling in erratic jerks. "You marked me. You tied your life force to a parasite. If it kills me now, it kills you. Then you better not die," Varric countered, his voice a low, rough growl. He pushed himself off the wall, standing back up to his full, towering height. He reached out, his massive hand wrapping around the back of her neck, his thumb resting directly over the fresh bite mark. "The rot isn't the only monster in the dark anymore, Odessa," Varric warned, pulling her a fraction of an inch closer. "You belong to me. It doesn't get to consume you without going through me first." For the first time since the night her tribe was slaughtered, Odessa didn't feel entirely alone. The terror was still there, but it was matched by a sudden, fierce devotion to the monster standing in front of her. She opened her mouth to speak, but a deafening silence suddenly fell over the catacombs. The explosions above them stopped. The screams faded. The heavy, metallic hum of the purifier machine cut out. Varric's grip on her neck tightened. He immediately stepped in front of her, raising his broadsword. "Get behind me," Varric ordered. Footsteps echoed down the spiraling stone staircase. Slow, rhythmic, heavy with an old, suffocating authority that made the air in the catacomb grow completely stale. Boom! The heavy iron door of the lower level didn't just open. It violently exploded inward, the thick metal hinges shearing off completely. Dust and debris choked the frozen air. A tall figure stepped through the smoke. The king didn't wear a crown. He wore heavy, silver-plated armor. In his right hand he held a longsword forged from a dark, jagged meteorite. The blade hummed with sick green energy that devoured the little light in the room. In his left hand, he dragged something across the floor by its hair. With a casual, terrifying flick of his wrist, the king tossed the burden forward. Tamsin's body hit the stone floor at Varric's boots. Odessa slapped a hand over her mouth to trap a scream. The blind oracle wasn't dead, but she was barely breathing. Her white dress was soaked in crimson, and her shattered eyes were closed. A commendable distraction, the king said. His voice was smooth, cultured, and entirely devoid of empathy. But parlor tricks only delay the inevitable. Varric stared down at Tamsin, then shifted his golden eyes to his father. He didn't yell. He didn't show panic. You brought a toy sword to my home, Varric stated coldly. The king smiled. It was a terrifying, hollow expression. Your home? You own nothing, boy. Your title, your armor, the very breath in your lungs, it all belongs to me. The king's pale eyes drifted past Varric, locking onto Odessa. His gaze dropped to the bleeding, raw bite mark on her neck. His smile widened. You marked the vessel, the king noted. A dark, genuine amusement coloring his tone. How fiercely tragic. You think you saved her, didn't you? I am going to cut your head off, Varric promised, taking a slow step forward. No, you aren't, the king replied simply. The older man didn't raise his sword. He didn't drop into a fighting stance. He just stood perfectly still, looking at Varric with the pitying gaze of a master looking at a disobedient dog. You see, Varric, the king said softly. You have always been so obsessed with rebellion, so eager to prove you were nothing like me. But you never stopped to ask yourself why I let you live this long. Odessa's blood ran ice cold. The rod inside her chest violently curled into a tight ball of absolute terror. It knew. What are you talking about? Varric demanded, his grip on his broadsword tightening. The king reached into a small leather pouch on his belt. He pulled out a smooth black stone covered in glowing crimson runes. I am a master of alchemy, Varric, the king whispered. Did you really think I would raise a wolf in my own house without putting a collar on it? The king pressed his thumb against the glowing runes. Varric didn't even have time to swing his sword. He suddenly froze. His broadsword slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the stone floor. Varric's hands flew to his own chest. His golden eyes blew wide with pure, agonizing shock. He dropped to his knees, violently gasping for air that wouldn't come. Varric! Odessa screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. He didn't look at her. Varric violently coughed, and a stream of thick, black blood spilled from his lips onto the stone. Chapter 8. Varric did not scream. He collapsed onto his hands and knees, violently choking on his own breath. Thick, black blood spilled from his lips, staining the ancient stone floor. The invincible Alpha, the apex predator of the kingdom, was completely paralyzed by a small, glowing stone in his father's hand. What did you do to him? Odessa screamed, throwing herself in front of Varric to shield his fallen body. The king didn't flinch. He slowly walked down the remaining stairs, his silver armor gleaming in the dark. I simply pulled his leash, the king said, his voice maddeningly calm. Varric's massive hands clawed at his own chest. His golden eyes were wide with pure, agonizing shock. The dark magic from the mark on Odessa's neck was entirely weaponized against him, crushing his heart in an invisible vice. You poisoned him, Odessa snarled, her fangs fully extending. I secured my investment, the king corrected. He stopped a few feet away, looking down at his son with absolute disgust. I planted that dead man's switch inside his chest the day he was born. It is magically synced to the exact frequency of the rot. Odessa froze. The air in the catacombs suddenly felt impossibly thin. The king smiled, a cold, calculating expression. Did you really think I didn't know he was planning a rebellion? I let him play his little war games. I let him find you. I let him bring you right into my territory. The older man pointed the tip of his glowing, jagged sword at Varric. He thought he was defying me by choosing you as a bride. The king laughed, a dry, hollow sound. But he was just following my script. I needed the vessel brought out of hiding, and more importantly, I needed him to care about you. Odessa stopped breathing. You see, a weapon as powerful as the rot cannot be controlled by force alone, the king explained, his pale eyes locking onto Odessa. It must be controlled by leverage. The moment he marked you to share your burden, he didn't save you. He gave me the ultimate hostage. Varric let out a low, guttural growl. He tried to push himself off the floor, his muscles straining violently, but the king simply squeezed the black stone in his hand. Varric instantly slammed back down onto the stone, coughing up another sickening wave of black blood. Stop, Odessa yelled. She held her hands out. Stop hurting him. The choice is entirely yours, little vessel, the king said, lowering the rune stone slightly. Varric gasped, his lungs desperately fighting for air. Walk up those stairs, the king commanded, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "Step into the purifier in the courtyard. Let the machine extract my god from your veins. You will become a mindless, empty battery for my empire. Do that, and I will let the boy live." Odessa looked down. Varric was trembling, a cold sweat breaking out over his pale face. The king stepped closer. "But if you resist, if you unleash that curse against me, the shockwave will detonate the switch in his heart. He will die instantly, right here on the floor, drowning in his own blood. And then, I will take the parasite from your corpse anyway." The trap was perfect. It was brilliant. It was inescapable. If she fought, Varric died. If she surrendered, she became a living battery, and the world burned anyway. Deep inside her chest, the rot began to laugh. It wasn't a sound of fear. It was a sound of dark, chaotic ecstasy. "Break the cage," the entity whispered in her mind. Varric slowly turned his head. His golden eyes were dimming, the life violently draining from his massive frame. But he didn't look at his father. He looked at Odessa. "Don't," Varric choked out. Every word cost him a brutal amount of blood. "Don't. Submit to him. Let me die." Odessa stared into the eyes of the monster who had kidnapped her, the tyrant who had used her, the alpha who had just sacrificed half his soul to keep her sane. A terrifying, beautiful calm washed over her. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. Odessa leaned down. She framed Varric's pale, blood-stained face with both her hands. She pressed her lips to his in a fierce, brutal, and bloody kiss. It tasted like ash and tragedy. She pulled back, looking straight into his fading golden eyes. "I told you, General," Odessa whispered, her voice completely steady. "I walked into this kingdom on purpose, and I came here to destroy everything." Varric's eyes widened. Odessa didn't turn to face the king. She didn't attack the man holding the runestone. Instead, she raised her right hand. Her fingers curled into hardened black claws, but she didn't aim outward. She drove her hand violently against her own chest. She didn't tear her flesh. She plunged her hand straight into the glowing, black, magical cage swirling beneath her ribs, the very anchor that tied her life force to Varric's. "No," the king roared, instantly realizing what she was doing. He raised his jagged sword, lunging forward to stop her. But he was too late. Odessa's hand closed tightly around the invisible, magical tether connecting her to the king's kill switch. With a twisted, beautiful smile, she violently crushed it. Chapter 9. The tether did not snap with a loud noise. It shattered with a silent, absolute psychic shockwave that cracked the very foundation of the catacombs. Varric gasped. His spine arched as the crushing, agonizing vice around his heart instantly vanished. He sucked in a violent, rattling breath of freezing air, his hands dropping from his chest. The dead man's switch was gone. Odessa slowly pulled her hand away from her ribs. When she opened her palm, black, corrupted dust trickled through her fingers and hit the stone floor. She hadn't just broken the magic. She had completely annihilated the bridge that kept her human. "You stupid, arrogant bitch!" the king roared, losing his terrifying calm for the first time. He frantically squeezed the runestone in his hand, trying to re-engage the kill switch. But the red runes flickered, died, and the stone crumbled into useless gray chalk between his fingers. His ultimate leverage was gone. "Kill her!" the king screamed, raising his jagged meteorite sword and lunging forward. Odessa didn't move. She didn't raise her hands to defend herself. She just looked at him, her eyes completely, terrifyingly hollow. The pitch-black void didn't just fill her irises. It spilled over, weeping down her pale cheeks like tar. Her skin began to violently crack, glowing from the inside out with a sickening dark energy. "No," a voice echoed. It wasn't Odessa's voice. It wasn't the chorus of dead souls either. It was a sound so deep, so fundamentally wrong, that it made the ancient stone walls bleed. The rot was off the leash. The entity didn't just step out of her. It violently erupted. A catastrophic, blinding tidal wave of pure, concentrated decay exploded from Odessa's chest. The shockwave of black ash hit the king midair. He didn't even have time to swing his sword. The moment the dark energy touched the jagged meteorite blade, the indestructible metal rusted, fractured, and instantly disintegrated into fine powder. The king screamed. It was a wretched, pathetic sound of absolute terror. The rot slammed into his silver armor. The heavy metal instantly tarnished, turning brown, then black, before flaking away like dead leaves in a hurricane. "You made me," the rot hissed, the voice vibrating through the black storm. "And now I unmake you." The dark storm swallowed the king entirely. There was no blood, there was no gore. There was only the horrifying, accelerated speed of absolute ruin. The king's flesh withered, his bones dried, and within 3 seconds, the tyrant who had ruled the continent for decades was reduced to nothing but a cloud of dark ash scattering across the stone floor. Catharsis. Complete, merciless, and utterly absolute. The shockwave didn't stop there. It violently blasted upward, tearing through the ceiling of the catacomb, obliterating the courtyard above, and utterly vaporizing the massive purifier machine. Then, just as violently as it had erupted, the black storm collapsed. The deafening roar of destruction was instantly replaced by a terrifying, suffocating silence. Moonlight poured through the massive smoking crater in the ceiling, illuminating the ruined catacomb. Odessa stood in the center of the debris. She looked down at her own hands. They were trembling. The tips of her fingers were turning translucent, flaking away into glowing black embers. Without the magic tether, and with the rot fully expelled, her body had nothing left to sustain it. Her knees buckled. Odessa. Varric didn't run. He blurred. He caught her inches before she hit the stone floor, pulling her fragile, rapidly breaking body tightly against his chest. "No, no, no," Varric chanted, his voice a frantic, desperate rasp. He bit his own wrist, tearing the skin wide open. He aggressively pressed his bleeding arm to her lips. "Drink it. Drink the blood, Odessa. Take it all." Odessa weakly turned her head away. A soft, broken laugh escaped her lips. "It's gone, Varric," she whispered. Her voice was entirely her own again, faint, human, and undeniably dying. "I don't care about the curse," Varric roared. The invincible Alpha, the stoic general, was completely unraveling. His golden eyes were wide, frantic, and burning with unshed tears. "I didn't give the order. You don't explode until I give the order." He tried to use his alpha tone. He tried to force his dominance into her fading mind, commanding her to heal, commanding her to stay. But there was nothing left to command. Odessa reached up. Her hand was so light it barely registered against his skin. She traced the harsh line of his jaw, her thumb brushing over the jagged scar near his ear. "You don't own the bomb, Varric," she smiled, her signature, defiant smirk pulling at her pale lips even as they began to crack and crumble. "Please," Varric begged. The word cracked in half. The apex predator was on his knees in the dirt, begging a dying girl to stay. "Odessa, don't leave me in this wasteland." You survived the fire, General," Odessa whispered, her eyes locking onto his. The light in them was fading fast. "Now, you get to build the ruin." Her hand slipped from his face. Varric lunged, trying to catch her hand, trying to pull her back to his chest, but his fingers closed around empty air. Odessa shattered. She didn't die like a normal human. She violently dispersed. Her body crumbled into thousands of glowing dark embers, floating up toward the gaping hole in the ceiling like black snow. Varric froze. His arms were still wrapped tightly together, but he was holding absolutely nothing. Only the shredded, blood-stained fabric of her dress remained pooled in his lap. Footsteps skidded down the ruined stairs. Brecken burst into the catacomb, his sword drawn, covered in the dust of the collapsed estate. The beta took one look at the pile of ash where the king had stood, and then his eyes locked onto Varric. Brecken dropped his sword. The metal clattered loudly against the stone. Varric didn't look up. He didn't move. He buried his face into the torn, empty fabric of Odessa's dress. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. Instead, Varric threw his head back toward the open, moonlit sky and let out a roar. It was a sound of absolute, world-ending agony. The howl of an alpha whose mate had just been ripped from his soul. The sheer, devastating force of the sound shook the remaining pillars of the catacomb, shattering every remaining piece of glass in a 3-mile radius. The king was dead. The war was won. And Varric had lost everything. Chapter 10. 3 years. That was how long it took for the kingdom to forget the sun. The sky above the capital was permanently choked with a thick, gray haze. The royal palace had not been rebuilt with gold and marble. It had been reconstructed from black iron and the scorched stones of the king's ruined vanguard. It wasn't a kingdom anymore. It was a monument to a dead girl. Inside the great hall, the silence was absolute. The court was empty. No lords, no ladies, just the echoing sound of a wet rag frantically scrubbing against the cold floor. Brecken was on his hands and knees. The beta wore the dark uniform of the royal guard, but his eyes were completely hollow. He furiously scrubbed a massive dark stain near the base of the throne. "It won't come out," Brecken muttered to himself, his hands trembling. "The ghosts, they're still bleeding." Heavy footsteps echoed through the hall. Varric walked in. He didn't wear a crown. He wore his battle-worn leather armor, the silver clasps completely tarnished. The general who had destroyed an empire was gone. In his place was a tyrant who ruled a wasteland with an iron fist and a frozen heart. He stepped past Brecken without looking down. "You are going to kill yourself, Varric." The voice came from the shadows. Tamsin stepped out from behind a massive stone pillar. The oracle leaned heavily on a wooden cane. Her eyes were completely gone, just two hollow, scarred sockets left behind after the catastrophic use of the death's gaze. Varric didn't stop walking. He approached the throne, a jagged, terrifying seat forged from the melted weapons of the men who had failed to protect his mate. "I told you not to come to the surface, Oracle," Varric said coldly. "And I told you to stop reading the king's grimoires." Tamsin fired back, slamming her cane against the floor. "Brecken is losing his mind. Half your army is terrified of you. You are practicing the exact same dark alchemy you killed your father for." Varric turned around. His golden eyes were dull, completely devoid of warmth, but they flared with a sudden, lethal warning. "My father wanted to build a battery," Varric stated, his voice a low, threatening rumble. "I am building a door. You can't bring her back," Tamsin yelled, her voice breaking. The rot consumed her soul. "Varric, even if you reconstruct the vessel, what steps out of the dark won't be the girl you loved. It will be the plague." Varric stared at the blind woman. He didn't argue. He didn't deny it. He simply walked down the steps of the throne and stood inches from her face. "Then the plague will wear a crown," Varric whispered. "Get out of my hall." Tamsin shuddered, her head bowing in defeat. She turned and slowly limped away into the shadows. Varric didn't sit on the throne. He walked straight past it, descending the long, spiraling staircase back into the forbidden lower catacombs. The air down here hadn't changed in 3 years. It still smelled like ozone, old stone, and the faint, lingering scent of black ash. The center of the floor was covered in a massive, intricate alchemical circle carved directly into the bedrock. It wasn't drawn with chalk. It was drawn with blood. Varric stepped into the center of the circle. He dropped to his knees on the exact spot where Odessa had shattered into dust. He unclasped his armor, throwing the heavy leather aside. He pulled down the collar of his black shirt, exposing his neck. The scar was still there, the violent bite mark where he had anchored his soul to hers. The magic was dormant, but the physical tie had never broken. Varric pulled a jagged silver dagger from his boot. He didn't hesitate. He dragged the blade deep across his own palm. "I paid the toll," Varric commanded, his voice echoing in the dead silence. He slammed his bleeding hand directly onto the center rune of the circle. "You took half my soul. Now give me back what is mine." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the blood in the carved lines began to boil. A violent tremor shook the catacomb. The temperature plummeted so fast that frost instantly coated the stone walls. From the dark corners of the room, the dust began to move. Specks of black ash, the remains of the king, the remains of the magic, the remains of her slowly lifted into the air. They swirled, glowing with a sick, impossible energy, pulled toward the center of the blood circle like a dying star collapsing in on itself. The ash spun faster and faster, forming a towering, chaotic tornado of dark magic directly in front of Varric. The sheer force of the energy tore at Varric's skin, slicing his face, but the Alpha didn't blink. He didn't move an inch. He stared into the darkness with a terrifying, absolute hunger. Suddenly, the black storm collapsed. The shockwave knocked Varric backward. He caught himself on his hands, his breath violently leaving his lungs. The smoke cleared. A figure stood in the center of the blood circle. She was completely naked, her skin pale as porcelain, save for the thick, dark veins that pulsed visibly beneath her flesh like a second nervous system. Varric slowly looked up. Odessa tilted her head. Her eyes were not the soft color he remembered. They were twin pools of pitch-black void, endlessly dark and terrifyingly ancient. The entity had not just brought her back, they had fused completely. There was no more cage, there was only the predator. But when she looked down at the bruised, bleeding alpha kneeling at her feet, a slow, familiar smirk pulled at the corner of her lips, the signature mocking defiance that belonged entirely to Odessa. "You look terrible, General," her voice echoed. It was a chilling harmony, one part human girl, one part cosmic horror. Varric didn't speak. He couldn't. He crawled forward. The invincible tyrant, the man who had shattered an empire, didn't stand up to greet her. He stayed on his knees. He reached out, his trembling, blood-stained hands gently wrapping around her waist. He pressed his face against her cold stomach, inhaling the heavy, intoxicating scent of black ash and ruin. Odessa's dark, clawed hand slowly descended, burying her fingers into his hair. "You broke the laws of death," Odessa whispered, the black void in her eyes swirling with a dark, twisted affection. She forced his head up, making him look at her. "You called a monster home, Varric." Varric's golden eyes burned brighter than they had in 3 years. He leaned into her cold touch. "Then consume me," Varric vowed, his voice a ragged, desperate prayer. "Consume it all, my queen." Odessa smiled. It was a terrifying, beautiful thing. She leaned down, crashing her mouth against his in a brutal, wet kiss that tasted of blood, dark magic, and absolute destruction. And in the darkness of the catacombs, the new reign truly began.